read, but there's a line there that I always think about and try to think about as much as I can, which is her comment that, entering something like entering another's world, which you do when you interview, is a privilege, not a right. You don't have a right to person's stories, to their ideas, to their opinions. It is an incredible privilege to be able to enter someone's mind and thoughts and stories and memories and experiences. And I think that, it's just important to always keep that in mind. And Joanna, it sounds like you're 100% doing that. That it is a privilege, and you need to tread carefully and thoughtfully and put the emotional well-being of that person who's agreed to give from their time and their self for your work. I mean, to always hold that as a tremendous gift that, and I'm sure everyone is already thinking about that. But sometimes in the midst of this and the pressures you're under professionally or academically, it can be sometimes something to forget and see somebody as a data source rather than a multidimensional human being. So if we'll always keep that in mind as best we can, and let that be our guide about what to do. And I think that goodwill will show. And if you are showing that you're listening and that you're caring, and which is why to second Joanna's ideas here, that like active listening is a skill. I mean, it's not automatic. It's not some obvious thing that like you can just easily, you get somebody talking, you press record, and the rest you don't have to do, to really picking up any kind of body language cues that someone is under distress, that they don't want to go in the direction that has been opened, that they're sort of looking around, so you can sense that maybe somebody else is in the room and listening in that you don't see in your screen, but might be there, and you have to, adjust accordingly. But just to have affirm that you're listening, that the person's being heard. I can say here, and this sort of gets into maybe our third section about tips, is that I have found that to be a bit different. And so talking about body language and so forth, well, this is one thing that I found in doing online interviews, is that my own body language is extremely exaggerated to be able to communicate this sort of active listening. And sometimes it almost seems ridiculous, but I have done many interviews in which, this is super technical, but like on Zoom, that there's a delay or a lag time. So someone might be speaking and they speak and there's a small pause, which is typically where in an in-person setting, I would say something like, yes, or of course, or some small little word that signals that you're listening and that you understand and you're with them. But given the lag time, so someone's talking, there's a little pause. In person, I would insert that and then the person keeps going. With the lag time on Zoom, someone has a little pause. I, on my end here in Chicago, say, oh, yes. By that point, the person's already kept going, and it comes in as an interruption in after the fifth word of what they've already said. And then they kind of break and say, what? And I say, oh yeah. And it all becomes, the little filler words become awkward interruptions rather than helpful facilitators. So so what I have found then is I speak less, where normally in the in-person setting, I would be continually doing little words to show that I'm listening. I'm now more silent and instead use incredibly exaggerated body motions, and someone saying something where I would normally say, oh yeah, that's great. I'm like this, or I start motioning, to show and, to somehow show that I'm with them and that I'm listening, but use facial expressions and hand motions, and often keep silent. So that's something you might, I think it's something you might find as well and be prepared for and listen for. You have to listen that your little filler words or your questions are coming in as interruptions, gauge the timing, and adjust and use the other tools at your disposal to show the person that you're with them. Yeah, so we kind of went with that. That's one of the main things I had as far as tips. I guess what just Yes, that was a default zoomed us into our third section, Rima. I hope that's okay. I would also say there just to be aware of what you, similarly to be aware of what you don't see in your, I mean, you have a screen, you have what is caught by that person's screen. Rima sort of already alluded to this, to be conscious of the fact there could be another person in the room listening in the whole time that the person doesn't mention or you don't ask about or so forth. So just to be aware that you're not seeing the full picture in a way that you would see if you're more likely to see if you were in person, to just be aware of that and adjust accordingly. And I would say that for me, I found that investing in that sort of a letter that I send out to people and requesting an interview in the first place has been an important part of the project, much more so than in in-person environments where I'm usually making an arrangement by telephone call. I call someone, I talk to them, they say, sure, come over at 4 p.m. And there's not an exchange of a written exchange that leads to that interview. So that writing is an opportunity for you to help supplement the consent process and address ethical issues. So I would use that as an opportunity as a part of the project.
Yeah, and I think on both ends, the background, what you can see through that screen is usually curated. So people think about where they're going to sit for the interview. So it says something, right? Of course, if they have options, and yours as well, you're also thinking about. So this is like a very carefully curated context of, it's not like meeting in a cafe where they don't decide, right, where you meet them in a public space, but they're meeting you in their private spaces. They're thinking about where to sit, how to sit, etc. Sometimes not. One other tip, and something that has happened with me, is that sometimes you're interviewing someone and then there's someone else that joins, right? There's a child around who wants to say something about the topic, or who hears you saying something and wants, or a friend or a family member, or someone who wants to be included. This could happen, and we need to also think about it, right? How does the research allow for us including others? Do we make it, do we turn it to sort of a focus group, or do we really want them to be alone? And if we really want them to be alone, I think we need to, when we send out the email or message asking them, we need to make that very clear, and say, is such a space available? I'm thinking with time, maybe we will need to think about whether we can help them make arrangements. Is it easier? Also, I mean, the gendered aspect that we mentioned before, right? So sometimes for women who are at home, it might be easier to do it in the evening while, they've already put their kids to bed. As a woman researcher myself, maybe the evening is more complicated to go to the office because I don't want to interview from home because I have family. So we need to think about those work-life balance. When do we do work? How do we do it? As people from different genders or different positionalities. So these are all things that I don't have answers to, but I think at this point it's important to ask them as questions and start thinking about them and exchange more of our experiences until we start to see what the trends are, what are, how are people doing things in ways that work, what is it that doesn't work really. So I'm sure that we'll have this conversation for much, much longer